It has been less than a full week since Bo Davis announced that he was heading to LSU to take the defensive line coach, leaving that vacancy at the University of Texas. But in less than a full week, the Longhorns surely have felt the impact of his vacancy.
You are Locked On Longhorns, your daily podcast on the Texas Longhorns. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Locked On Longhorns, the show. Jonathan Davis, your host. Today's episode of Locked On Longhorns is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. On today's episode of Locked On Longhorns, we are discussing the impact of Texas losing Bo Davis that we've already felt in less than a week. In the second segment, Silas Bowden, the explosive wide receiver out of Oregon State, visited Texas recently out of the transfer portal. A lot of people believe that Texas might be the likely destination for Bowden, but is Sark possibly over-recruiting the wide receiver position? Then in the third segment, our forever head coach, previously mentioned, Steve Sarkisian, got an extension, got a pay raise. I discussed that in the last segment. All of that and more on today's episode of Locked On Longhorns, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So I guess last week, like January 10th was not the best day for Longhorn fans, right? Because two, major coaching decisions were announced that day that both affected the Texas Longhorns. Now, one of them ended up being all right? But the first one was that Bo Davis was leaving the University of Texas to go back to his alma mater, LSU, and fill their defensive line coach vacancy, leaving one at the University of Texas. And that's what this first segment will be about. The second one was the GOAT Nick Saban retiring, right? And instantly the thought process was that Steve Sarkisian would be a prime target or candidate for that head coaching vacancy. Now, that decision by Nick Saban led to an extension and a pay raise for Steve Sarkisian. So we were good there, but we still have yet to replace Bo Davis as our defensive line coach at the University of Texas. And as I'll get to in this segment, in less than a full week, we have definitely felt the impact of not having a defensive line coach, period, or specifically not having Bo Davis at the 40 acres. Now, I tell you all the time that I'm on Twitter a lot. So I did see somebody post something. I'm not sure if it was from Inside Texas, Orange Bloods, or 24/7 Sports, or they were just rambling on Twitter. I saw something about Texas had hired a defensive line coach, but they had not been announced, and they're on the same caliber as Bo Davis. But I saw that like 4 or 5 days ago. So at this point, I'm going to call cap on that because I don't think they would have hired a defensive line coach the same caliber of Bo Davis and just sat on it for almost a week when they're struggling to recruit the position right now, right? So I'm going to say that Texas needs to, hurry up and fill that vacancy. And I'm going to say that right now, not having Bo Davis is making a huge impact on this football program going into next year. The first thing that we saw in terms of the immediate impact of losing Bo Davis was Jamari Caldwell, right? The really good, really stout defensive tackle from the University of Houston who was in the transfer portal. And he ended up committing to the University of Oregon. And he was listed at 6'1", 325. And last year, Jamari Caldwell at the University of Houston in 12 games totaled 6.5 sacks, which is really disruptive and productive from an interior defensive lineman in only 12 games. And they're usually getting, double teamed, especially a player of his caliber, and a forced fumble in the interior in 2023, right? He's the 20th overall player in the transfer portal and the second-ranked defensive tackle behind only Walter Nolan, who was the number one overall player in the transfer portal and was the number one overall player in the 2022 class coming out of high school. So that would have been a huge piece to help replace Byron Murphy and Savondre Sweat. If you could bring in a top 20 overall player in the transfer portal that was productive enough to get 6.5 sacks from the interior last year in just 12 games. Prior to the announcement of Bo Davis leaving for LSU, right, Texas was seen as the likely landing spot for Jamari Caldwell in the transfer portal. There was a lot of smoke that he would leave U of H and Texas would be the likely destination for Jamari Caldwell. But 2 days after Bo Davis left the University of Texas on January 10th, Jamari Caldwell committed to Oregon on January 12th. So you have to wonder if Bo Davis stays at the University of Texas, is Jamari Caldwell a Longhorn, right? Does he end up committing to the Texas Longhorns and provide a big boost to that room that lost Trill Carter, Savondre Sweat, and Byron Murphy and has major question marks going into next year? I guess at this point, we'll never know. But you have to think that Texas would obviously have been more of a player for Jamari Caldwell's services had Bo Davis not left in the middle of his recruitment. Dominic McKinley is the second example we have of an immediate impact of Bo Davis leaving the 40 acres. Dominic McKinley, the 27th overall player in the country, a defensive tackle, prospect, 5-star out of the state of Louisiana. And Texas had been in the running for Dominic McKinley dating back to last year, even after his commitment to Texas A&M on September 1st. So Dominic McKinley is definitely a player that, Bo Davis and the University of Texas recruiting staff wanted to make sure that they recruited through the whistle, right? It's a dominant player at a huge position of need that could have came in right away and been a really good player for the University of Texas on that defensive line. And Texas seemed to be in a really good spot throughout the 2023 season with Dominic McKinley, even though he had not committed to the University of Texas, because when you looked at the way that the Texas Longhorns football team played in 2023, you would say that Dominic McKinley would look at that and say, okay, that's somewhere that I want to play, right? A team going 12-2, going to the college football playoff and winning their conference championship. When you looked at the way that T'Vondre Sweat and Byron Murphy played in the 2023 season, both being All-Americans, one being Defensive Lineman of the Year in the conference, one being Defensive Player of the Year overall in the conference, Dominic McKinley could have looked at that and said, wow, look at the development of those two players. Look at the high-end production of those two players. The University of Texas is high on my radar. And then when you look at what was happening at Texas A&M simultaneously, which was, I guess the biggest competitor for him at that point, and he had committed on September 1st. So I wouldn't even say the biggest competitor. That's where he was committed to, right? When you looked at what Texas A&M was doing, they were having a horrible season, which led to Jimbo Fisher getting dismissed and a max exodus of all of those talented players from 2022 entering the transfer portal, right? So at that point, based on what Texas did, based on what LSU did, which wasn't as impressive as Texas, but it was still better than Texas A&M, and the fact that they had lost their coach, it was a foregone conclusion that Dominic McKinley at some point would decommit from Texas A&M. But Texas felt really good about their chances, even over LSU, which was an in-state competitor. Now, Dominic McKinley committed to LSU on December 31st, and this was 10 days before Bo Davis officially left the University of Texas. But after Bo Davis went to LSU, there was reporting that part of the pitch to get Dominic McKinley to LSU was that Bo Davis would be his defensive line coach, right? I can't, confirm that or dispute that. I'm not sure how long these things take, behind the scenes to get done, but it is very possible that a major recruiting pitch to Dominic McKinley is, hey, we are in the works of getting Bo Davis to come here and be your defensive line coach, come here and be developed the same way that we saw T'Vondre Sweat and Byron Murphy be last year at the University of Texas. And it's completely plausible that one of the biggest reasons for him deciding to go to LSU and leaving Texas A&M was Bo Davis. So if Bo Davis stays at the University of Texas, does Texas land Dominic McKinley at the defensive tackle position? You have to wonder. And the last thing that we've seen in terms of immediate impact from Bo Davis leaving already in less than a week is DeAndre Robinson, right? He was the composite ranked 252nd player in the country out of the state of Florida, committed to the University of Texas. And a lot of people, pretty much anybody who's ever seen him play, has said that ranking, 252nd in the country, does not do him justice. And he started off, I think, in the 400s or the 500s. So he rose over 200 spots in just his senior year alone. He had 60 total offers, even when he was a 3-star prospect. So that tells you that, maybe the people that recruit and, handle football on a daily basis may know a little bit more than the people at the recruiting sites, right? Could have been a big rotation piece this year and the future of the position at the 40 acres. But the latest reporting is that he did not move in on the day he was expected to move in and is expected to request a release out of his national letter of intent and reopen his recruitment, right? That is a direct reflection of Texas, one, not having a defensive line coach in place, period, and two, Bo Davis leaving for LSU. And it's very possible that DeAndre Robinson could be headed to LSU with Bo Davis. So those are 3 players that should have been or could have been in a Texas jersey next year that will not be likely because Bo Davis left the 40 acres. And without Bo Davis, what will the development of Alfred Collins, Vernon Broughton, and Sadir Mitchell look like going into next season? So it has been less than a week since Bo Davis left the University of Texas to go to LSU. And once again, we have already seen the impact of that decision. A quick word from our sponsors, and we talk about Silas Bolden and maybe, possibly, hopefully, is Sark going to open up the wide receiver position next year to get more players involved? We talk about that next. Today's episode of Locked On Longhorns is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. The NFL regular season is wrapping up, but there's still time to get in on the action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's $150 in bonus bets, win or lose. The app It's so easy to use, and there are so many different ways to bet, like live same game parlays, finding bets in the new Explore tab, making a parlay in the Parlay Hub, the best way to find popular parlays, and more. So visit FanDuel.com/locked on and make your first bet a layup with FanDuel, the official partner of the National Football League. All right, so in the second segment, we're going to talk about Silas Bolden, but also talk about Steve Sarkisian, his wide receiver usage over the last 3 years, and if that's something he plans to open up a little bit in 2024 heading into the SEC. So if you've been paying attention this offseason, Texas has absolutely been killing it in the transfer portal, and they've killed it at the wide receiver position, right? Based on us losing 3 wide receivers, our top 3 pass catchers at that position to the NFL draft, there were some question marks, going into next season in terms of who would be our top pass catchers. Would they be ready to perform at a high level due to their youth? And I think Steve Sarkisian has done a really good job of, trying to answer those questions personnel-wise by going into the transfer portal and getting some really talented players. So first we got Matthew Golden from U of H, who we all saw, scored 2 touchdowns against Texas last year, and he scored 15 touchdowns in just 2 years at U of H. So, he could be very explosive for us at the wide receiver position, but also in the in the return game, right? Replacing some of what we lost with Xavier Worthy. Then we went out and got Isaiah Bond on Sunday, one of the best deep threats in college football last season at the wide receiver position, very explosive. And in my opinion, I said it on yesterday's podcast, made the biggest play of the college football season, catching that 4th and 31 in the Iron Bowl to beat Auburn and, propel Alabama to the SEC championship, which ultimately propelled them to the college football playoff. So they had already done a really good job of addressing the question marks for the wide receiver room in 2024 in the transfer portal, but it looks like they're not done yet, right? Because Silas Bolden, who was in the portal from Oregon State, a transfer wide receiver, recently visited Texas, and the Longhorns seem like right now the favorite for his services, right? So it seems like Silas Bolden could end up at the University of Texas as well. Now, last year, Silas Bolden had 830 scrimmage yards for Oregon State. That's receiving and rushing. I think he had like 9 or 10 carries, so they actually used him a good amount in the rushing game last year. And he had 7 touchdowns with 830 scrimmage yards for a really improved Oregon State team. He also had 7 plays from scrimmage last year of 30-plus yards. So he's super explosive, right? If you're doing the math, if you're good at math at home, then you can see that over 25% of his yards last year came on just 7 plays. But he still had 830 scrimmage yards, right? So it wasn't like he just had 8 or 9 plays that were very explosive, and that's all he did, right? He was very productive. But like I said, over 25% of his yards came on just 7 plays of 30-plus yards or more. And then I think he had like 4 over 40 yards and a couple over 50. So he can definitely stretch the field and hit his head on the goalpost from anywhere on the field. The question is, if Silas Bolden decides to come to the University of Texas in 2024, who will Texas use at the wide receiver position in 2024, right? And is Sark starting to possibly over-recruit the position? Now, I know you can never have enough talent, but you can only put a certain amount of players on the field, right? And based on the data we've seen at 3 years under Steve Sarkisian, we don't get a ton of wide receivers involved, right? So when you look at it in 2021, right, Xavier Worthy was our number 1 wide receiver as a true freshman, and he had 62 catches. The next wide receiver on the list was 26 catches for Jordan Whittington, who got hurt early on in the season. Bijan Robinson was our second leading receiver in 2021. You had 24 catches for Josh Moore, who didn't finish the season, and you had 18 catches for Marcus Washington. So in reality, I guess due to injuries and some troubles within the program, in 2021, you really only relied on 1 receiver consistently, and that was Xavier Worthy. Then when we move on to 2022, we had 60 catches for Xavier Worthy. We had 50 catches for Jordan Whittington. I know Isaiah Nayor was supposed to be a big part of the rotation and was possibly supposed to look like, this year in 2023, how it looked like in 2022, but he tore his ACL, and that was a chance for Casey Kane or somebody else to step up and be utilized as a big part of the wide receiver rotation. I'm not sure who Brennan Marion decided he trusted or didn't. I'm not sure who Steve Sarkisian decided he trusted or didn't, but our third wide receiver in 2022 only had 8 catches, and that was Casey Kane. And I think our 4th wide receiver was I'm forgetting his name right now, but the transfer from Iowa State, the wide receiver, he only had 2 catches this year. I can't remember. He only had 2 catches in 2022. I can't remember his name. Hopefully somebody puts it in the comments off the top of my head. Moving on to 2023. So we see that even in 2022, we only utilized 2 receivers, right? Which was an upgrade from 2021, right? And then in 2023, we had this past season 75 catches for Xavier Worthy, 55 catches for Adonai Mitchell, and 42 catches for Jordan Whittington. So even though I'm biased and I feel like Jordan Whittington was still underutilized, we did a really good job of getting 3 wide receivers involved, right? Our best job of that since Steve Sarkisian took over at the University of Texas. But when you look at it last year, Jonte Cook was our 4th receiver, you can say, on the depth chart as a true freshman. And he had 8 catches last year, most of those coming in garbage time when we were already beating up on teams pretty bad. So in reality, in 3 years under Steve Sarkisian has not heavily utilized 3 wide receivers or more than 3 wide receivers at any point. And the last 2 years, the 4th wide receiver on our depth chart has ended up with 10 catches total, and 8 of them came from Jonte Cook in 2023, right? So based on 3 years of data from Steve Sarkisian at the University of Texas, we know that only 3 wide receivers will be heavily utilized during the football season unless he's going to go through major schematic changes in the offseason and add or open up the passing game in 2024. But like I said, based on what we've seen at 3 years under Steve Sarkisian at the University of Texas, I can't assume that going into this season, because at some point you are who you are, right? Especially as an offensive mind and a play caller, you like what you like. And we know Steve Sarkisian's still going to lean on that inside run, and he's still going to lean on, his tight ends and 12 personnel, right? So I would be naive to think, until I see it, that Texas is going to do a better job or a good job of incorporating 4 wide receivers into this offense. So based on 3 years of data at the University of Texas under Steve Sarkisian, if we're looking at Matthew Golden, Isaiah Bond, Silas Bolden, Jonte Cook, DeAndre Moore, and Ryan Wingo, right? I believe those are the top 6 players in the wide receiver rotation right now, assuming that Silas Bolden does indeed come to the University of Texas. We should only expect 3 of those 6 players to have a huge role on this football team in 2024. But I know a lot of the fans are excited to see a player like Ryan Wingo, or excited to see a player like Jonte Cook, or excited to see a player like DeAndre Moore, right? And for 2 of those players, they're in their second year. Even Ryan Niblett, he's in his second year. Ryan Wingo is in his first year, but he's a very talented true freshman. Hell, even behind that, right? I mean, somebody has to sit, but you got Parker Livingstone and Freddie Dubose and Aaron Butler, who are very talented as well. But if you're bringing in 3 transfers at that position, I would expect the pitch to Silas Bolden, Matthew Golden, and Isaiah Bond in 2024 is that you're going to play a lot, right? So where does that leave talented players who we've been waiting to see at the 40 acres, like Jonte Cook, Ryan Niblett, and DeAndre Moore, right? Based on 3 years of data, it would seem like that would leave those wide receivers out of the equation, and our 3 biggest pass catchers at that position in 2024 would be transfers. Now, like I said, you can never have enough talent, right? So I'm not going to sit here and tell Steve Sarkisian to stop recruiting the wide receiver position, right? Because obviously the more players you have at that position, the more likelihood that you'll have 3 that play at a high level, right? But like I said, we're in an era of NIL and, the transfer portal and players dipping at the first sign of, being unhappy or being underutilized. And I just don't see a scenario in which if Silas Bolden, Matthew Golden, it's crazy how their names rhyme like that, and Isaiah Bond are huge parts of this football team next year, that will be able to feature Ryan Wingo, DeAndre Moore, Jonte Cook, or Ryan Niblett in an increased fashion, or a fashion that would make them happy in their second or first year. So, and maybe Ryan Wingo as a true freshman, you don't really have to worry about that. But I do think Jonte Cook, DeAndre Moore, and Ryan Niblett will come into the season with the expectation that they'll touch the ball, right? It'd be a big part of this rotation. So you can never have enough talent, but I do wonder if Steve Sarkisian is over recruiting the wide receiver room right now based on the way that he's used wide receivers the last 3 years at the 40 acres. Now, if he plans on opening up the offense, if he plans on expanding the passing game, going to more of a spread look and using, maybe 4 wide receivers at a time, or rotating the wide receivers more often, then it certainly makes sense the way that he's recruiting the wide receiver position right now. But the way we've played offense the last 3 years at the 40 acres, it just seems like we're setting up a scenario and we're going to have a lot of talented but unhappy players in that wide receiver room. But Sark is our forever head coach, and I'm so glad to have him. And after a quick word from our sponsors, I give my thoughts on his extension and pay raise. Today's episode of Locked On Longhorns is brought to you by Jase Medical. I know we come to sports to escape from some of the crazy realities of real life, but can we just talk for a minute about preparing for real life. According to the FDA, pharmacies are running out of antibiotics like amoxicillin right in the middle of the worst flu season in over a decade. You've heard it. Everybody's sick or been sick over the last month. This is scary. I can't imagine a more helpless feeling than if one of my family members, one of my friends, or one of my coworkers got sick while a supply chain issue kept them from the life-saving medication they needed. Thankfully, we should be okay because of Jase Medical. The Jase case is a pack of 5 different antibiotics to treat a long list of bacterial illnesses, including UTIs, respiratory infections, sinuses, skin infections, amongst others. This stuff could happen to any of us. Visit jasemedical.com and complete your physician encounter. It will be reviewed by a board-certified physician, and your medications will be dispensed by a licensed pharmacy at a fraction of the regular cost. It's never been more important to be prepared than today. Go to jasemedical.com and use offer code LOCKED ON to get $20 off your order. All right, I just want to give my quick thoughts on, Steve Sarkisian getting his extension and pay raise. He likely was going to get it anyway based on what he's built the last 3 years at the University of Texas. But I do think the decision from Nick Saban to retire and Steve Sarkisian at least being perceived as a target for that job put some pressure on the administrators at the University of Texas to get that done a little bit faster, right? And what a testament it is to Steve Sarkisian that in just 3 short years, you've built something aside from Alabama, right, that is so good, right, and looks so powerful moving forward. And it's in such a good position moving forward that you were able to turn down the Alabama job just 3 years after leaving, right? Because Alabama is one of the most historical coaching destinations and one of the most historical programs in college football all time, right? I'm sure like when he left, he thought it would be an honor to replace Nick Saban at the University of Alabama. But what he's built in 3 years at the University of Texas, especially beating Alabama on the road in this past season, proves as though, right, that in just 3 years, at least he has put Texas on a level playing field with the Alabama Crimson Tide moving forward, which is crazy, right? And I know it has to be crazy to him in some aspects because I know he remembers and I know he still leans on the time when he was down bad, right? There was a time where he got his first head coaching job at Washington and he did, way more than the previous coaching regime, but, he was a victim of his own expectations. And he got them to 7 wins, which was way better than the 0 wins they were accustomed to. But once he got them to 7, they wanted 8, 9, and 10, and they wanted to compete at the highest level, and he could not get them there, right? So even though he did things that coaching staffs before him couldn't do at Washington, he became a victim of his own expectations. And when he started winning at Washington and when he turned them back into a competent program, they screamed more and more and more, and he couldn't deliver, right? So they turned sour on him. But he leaves, it goes to USC, which at the time I'm sure is his dream job, right? And they win in the first year. He's recruiting at a high level. Everything looks peaches and cream, right? But he's dealing with personal struggles, internal struggles that ended up winning the battle. And he ends up out of coaching, right? And at that moment, I'm sure when he was down bad and he was going through it every day and people wouldn't return his calls and, he was losing people in his life and he was making decisions that affected not only him, but everybody around him, possibly in a negative way. I'm sure he never thought that he would be at this moment. When he was in that rut, when he was in that tunnel, I'm sure he never thought he would see the light at the end. But then he gets that opportunity. And that's why he reveres Nick Saban, right? Because he gets that second opportunity from Nick Saban. And he goes to the University of Alabama and he takes advantage of it. And then he goes to the Atlanta Falcons. It doesn't work out, right? But Nick Saban brings him back. And it's glorious at the University of Alabama. And it leads to a national championship. And it leads to Steve Sarkisian getting this job at the University of Texas. And now, with an extension, with a pay raise, with Texas looking like one of the premier programs in college football, with him being in a position just 3 years after leaving Alabama to basically snub his nose at the Alabama coaching vacancy in a job search, it has to be glorious. And he has to be right now, theoretically, he's at the top of the world. He has to lean back on those moments when he was down bad and going through those personal struggles and look at where he is now and say, man, there was a time where I didn't even think this is possible, but it can be a story to all of us, right? And it's a testament to his hard work and his perseverance and what he's gone through over the last 7-8 years that led him to this point, right? And it could be a story for all of us that when you're going through those moments, right? Like when you're down bad and when it feels like things aren't going your way, and when it feels like, everybody's against you and things are just crumbling in your world, right? Look at Steve Sarkisian. Look at where he is now. And imagine how he felt when he was dismissed from USC and his life was turning upside down. And you can look at that situation and say, I am not what I'm going through, right? I am not what I'm going through. And this is only temporary, right? This is only temporary. But I know one day I'm going to be back where I should be. One day I'm going to be so good that this will be a testament of how far I've come since I've been in this position, right? Like I said, Steve Sarkisian at one point was down bad. Steve Sarkisian at one point probably felt hopeless. And now he's on the top of the world, theoretically. And that could be the situation for all of us, right? Like I said, regardless of what you're going through, you could be Steve Sarkisian one day at the top of the world or at the top of your field. All it takes is perseverance. All it takes is grit. And all it takes is belief that you are better than what you're currently going through. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Locked On Longhorns, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.